Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about supporting the whole child after a dyslexia diagnosis. So, looking beyond reading at that whole child. And I've heard from so many families that I work with about really how overwhelming that diagnosis of dyslexia can be. I mean, I have answers as to why your student has been struggling to learn to read, but sometimes that diagnosis brings really just as many questions as it does answers, right? What do I do next? How can I help? What is dyslexia? Will my child learn to read? But we're not just looking at reading because we know that effective intervention is a non-negotiable. But we also want to look at supporting that whole child and not just their literacy development. So that's what we're talking about today. We're not looking at IEPs or intervention, but about the big picture. So let me introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Bush. That's my website, leadchanges.com, where you can always find me. And, before we dive in, I just want to share a little bit about how I approach this work. So I spend my days helping families and schools make sense of dyslexia beyond just those reading scores. So we're looking at how it shows up in language, attention, confidence, everyday learning, the big picture. And my focus is really on helping parents understand what to notice, what questions to ask, and really how to help their kiddo in those practical, sustainable ways at home and also at school. So tonight really isn't about pushing harder or doing more. It's kind of about hitting pause and looking big picture at that child development and how we can support the whole child who may have dyslexia. And that's what led me to publish my first book, Dyslexia and Your Newly Diagnosed Child. It came out a few months ago. And I really wanted families to have that holistic view and to have in their hands from the get-go answers to these really pressing questions about that whole child development. So I'm going to be pulling from that book today, but to talk a little bit more about myself, I am a CALT, which is a certified academic language therapist. I'm also a licensed dyslexia therapist. I've got a bunch of other certifications in education. I did my specialist preparation program from House Education Center, and then also have done a whole bunch of other training around academic language, structured word inquiry, structured literacy, kind of all of this stuff. I have two master's degrees and, of course, my undergrad as well. And so, like I said, this is my company, Lead Changes. It is a little bit of a horsey reference because I'm here in Houston, Texas. And while I help families all over the world, I am here in Texas. I do ride horses. And I also teach equine assisted therapy. And that sort of broader therapeutic lens is what I bring to my work. So even if I'm doing a reading lesson or supporting a family or coaching teachers, we're looking at that broader therapeutic lens that we can bring to the work that we're doing. So to start off with, let's see if I was going to ask you, what is dyslexia? What would you say? So to make sure we're all on the same page, pun intended, let's talk about what is dyslexia quickly so that we know we're on the same page before we start talking about the impact we can see it have on different individuals. So dyslexia is having a hard time learning individual words, learning to read individual words, right? So dyslexia is a specific learning disability characterized by difficulties in word reading and or spelling, right? So that word reading is what we see most commonly when we're talking about English. Now, the International Dyslexia Association, they did publish a new definition last year, 2025, in October, and they expanded it in a couple of ways. And one of those is to have that and or spelling. And now they did that because we know that dyslexia shows up in all different languages all over the world. And in some languages that are more transparent with their orthographic systems, for example, Spanish, we can see that dyslexia really just impacts spelling and not necessarily come out in the impact of learning to read individual words. Now, I will say from my own personal experience and the work that I've done over the last, almost 2 decades, I haven't really ever seen an individual with dyslexia, when we're talking about English, the English writing system, have difficulties just in spelling. There's always going to be something bubbling in there with reading. Now, maybe a little bit more obvious in spelling, but I've never seen it be 100% just spelling. So that's my 2 cents, just to throw that in there about dyslexia in English. But at the end of the day, dyslexia is having a hard time learning to read individual words. Now, that reading and or spelling difficulty at the word level may involve accuracy, speed, or both. So we may be making mistakes and or we may be reading more slowly, or maybe we're doing both, right? We also know that dyslexia exists all over the world, right? Now, it does shift and change a little bit depending on the writing system of that language that's used in that country, or the language that that individual is reading and writing in, but it exists all over the world. This is not a uniquely English phenomena. We also know that these difficulties of dyslexia occur along a continuum of severity. And they persist even with instruction that is effective for the individual's peers. So even if the instruction they've been getting in the classroom is working for everybody else in that class, but that individual is having a hard time and it's just not really going away, that's a big sign. And now we know that these difficulties do exist on that continuum. So when you see your diagnosis, for example, you're going to see mild, moderate, or severe. I personally like to think of it as this wheel. And this is a graphic that's in my book. And I really like this graphic because we know what dyslexia is, and it's the same depending on no matter who we're talking about, but it does present a little bit differently. So everybody's version of dyslexia is a little different, and that's because everyone's different, right? And so we may see that individual's profile spike in different ways across these different areas, depending on how their dyslexia is presenting, how severe it is, if there's comorbidity, if there's other challenges, all of that. But dyslexia has to do with what's going on in the brain. So there are a few things that we know about reading in general. So let's start there. So we know that in general, reading is actually not a naturally occurring human phenomenon. So if we were to travel back in time about 6,000 years ago, humans developed this idea of writing, which then led to, of course, reading, because if I'm going to write a mark, someone's got to read it. And prior to that, as humans, we weren't reading. And so because of this, there really is no one part of the brain that is activated when we read and or write versus listening and speaking, for example, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But what's happening is there's all these different parts of the brain that are kicking on together. And some researchers call this a symphony, that it's like watching a symphony play with the different parts of the brain that are kicking on and all playing and working together. And we call that the pathway. So the reading pathway. This is an image that comes from Dr. Sally Shaywitz, who does amazing research at Yale, has really, really expanded our knowledge of dyslexia. But you can see that we have that reading pathway. And what happens for somebody with dyslexia is that pathway is less effective. And that's because there are parts of the brain that maybe aren't working as strongly as we may expect them to, or as we may see in a reader with a more efficient reading pathway. All right, so there's dyslexia. We're now on the same page about its core definition of what it is, right? It's having a hard time learning to read words. But we know there's all these knock-on effects, right? And we can see these secondary consequences. I know I see them all the time in my own practice, even when I was a classroom teacher or in leadership. I know educators I work with, parents, right? We see all of these secondary consequences all the time. And the great thing about the new definition that the IDA came released last year in October 2025 is they've officially recognized a lot of these secondary consequences, which is great news. So let's walk through some of them. In order to understand some of these secondary consequences, we first need to understand this simple view of reading. It comes from Golf and Tumner, 1986. And as you can see, it's a pretty straightforward, simple multiplication equation. Now, what we may or may not remember from multiplication is that if either one of those factors are a zero, then my answer will be a zero. My product will be a zero. So that means I've got on the one side of my multiplication equation, I've got decoding or word recognition. I can read the words. Then I have the language comprehension. I can understand the words. When both of those are sufficiently strong, that I can understand what I'm reading. But now, what happens with a lot of individuals with dyslexia is that decoding skill set is impacted. That's a zero or less than we want it to be. Now, of course, we also have some readers where that language comprehension may be impacted, but if either one of those are impacted, we're going to have a negative impact on our reading comprehension, right? Makes sense. And that's where we come across the first secondary consequence that the IDA has officially recognized. Secondary consequences include reading comprehension problems. Well, obviously, right? If I'm having a hard time reading the words, I'm going to have a hard time understanding what I'm reading. That makes sense. But let's talk about some of these other secondary consequences that can come from this having a hard time understanding what we're reading, right? Having a hard time coming from this reading comprehension. And this is where we see some of those other secondary consequences. But if we're a struggling reader past third grade, I know I use third grade because that's kind of a key shifting point where we've gone from learning to read to now reading to learn. And so from third grade onward, classroom instruction is centered around this understanding that my students are going to understand what I'm reading. Therefore, I can use that text, that passage, whatever, to teach what I'm trying to teach, right? Not always possible, but let's talk about what some of these other secondary consequences can be if reading comprehension is still impacted past the third grade. So we may be looking at an overall diminish in language development, right? And that's because we know before we make that switch from learning to read to reading to learn, the biggest way that we acquire new vocabulary is through conversations with adults, right? Or conversations with peers or from all, conversations. Once we make that shift, we're starting to acquire our bulk of new vocabulary words through reading, right? And that's because the words we use in literature are often words that we may not see in day-to-day conversations, right? We also know that if reading is impacted, well, it's quite likely that writing is as well. And that's because reading and writing go hand in hand. Reading always comes first. Now, I will say I've seen like rare occasions where the writing development comes before the reading development, but that's usually because there's something else going on. So I shouldn't say always, but let's say almost always. Now, if I'm not doing very well at reading, I'm probably not going to enjoy it, right? Because who wants to do something that they know is going to be really hard? And if I know reading is really hard and I know I go to school every day where I'm asked to do something that's going to be really hard, it's not going to be long before my confidence starts to take a knock, right? Which is not what we want. And this kind of brings us to a lot of those other secondary consequences that we may see from the IDA's definition. So we know it includes reading comprehension problems, but also reduced reading and writing experience, that can impede growth in language knowledge, written expression, and overall academic achievement. It's not what we want. And this kind of leads us to what we call the Matthew effect, which is this downward spiral, right? Reading's really hard, therefore I don't want to do it, therefore I'm not getting better, therefore it's still hard, therefore I'm not learning new words, I don't want to go to school. It's just this downward spiral. And that downward spiral can have a big emotional impact. And this, I will say, is one of the trickiest parts of my work with families, and even my intervention work with students. I know, actually, the segue into a short little story. So it was one of my very first students when I was doing my training to now be a CALT and a dyslexia therapist. And I had done my initial training. I was in my practicum. So the program I did, it's 700 hours of practicum. It was a lot. But this was one of my first kiddos that I was working with. And I had done all the things that I'd been taught to do, right? I read the script from the book, I did the warm up, I followed the schedule, I used the manipulatives, I did it all. I did all the things I was supposed to do. And this was probably maybe session 5. And I went to put that one page of words, two, 3 letter words, I, it, sit. And I put that page in front of this little 7-year-old, 8-year-old girl, and she just burst into tears. Because even with all the work that I had done, she saw those words on the page and she just instantly burst into tears. And that's when I was like, okay, everything I've learned so far is not enough. I've got to do more. Because we know that emotional impact can be really big, especially before effective intervention is put into place. And again, this brings us back to my talk off of our sidetrack, back on track. This brings us to one of the other things that the IDA has rolled into the new definition, which I think is amazing. They have officially recognized these other impacts. And they say psychological well-being also may be affected. We also know that navigating the world may be affected, right? I mean, think of all the times we have to read just getting around the city. I mean, bus schedules or um, the flights at the airport or, whatever it is, we're constantly having to read. And then, of course, employment. And this was one of the other things that the IDA added, that employment opportunities also may be affected. All right. So that was kind of a speedy walkthrough of what dyslexia is and its knock-on effects. So if we go back to that original question of what is dyslexia, do you think your answer might have changed? Now, here's where we get to the point of the talk, right? As educators, as parents, we have seen these secondary consequences firsthand. We've seen them again and again. And as parents, you know all too well that we're not talking about uh, data points on a report or goals in an IEP or a diagnosis from some manual. We're talking about real kids. And this is where my work steps in. So really, it's all about zooming out and looking at that learner as a whole and working to support them holistically. And so to do that, we're going to walk through kind of 4 big buckets of challenge areas that we often see impacted for a kiddo or learner with dyslexia. Right? So obviously literacy language, we know that's going to be one of the big areas, right? But we're also going to look at social and emotional development, cognitive and other academic skills, and sensory and motor integration. So, yes, we know that dyslexia is having a hard time learning to read words. We know it has these knock-on effects. We also know that it's more common than not that dyslexia is not necessarily going to be the only diagnosis. There very well may be something else along for the ride. So we're going to go through these four common challenge areas that can coexist with dyslexia or be impacted by dyslexia. And we're just going to touch the surface, but let's get started. So literacy and language, right? We know this is the biggest area here. And I have to start this section by saying that we cannot replace effective, high quality intervention. We can't, right? For a kiddo with dyslexia, a learner with dyslexia, an adult with dyslexia, it is a non-negotiable if we want to effectively teach them to read. So structured literacy, the OG approach, whatever term we're using, a learner with dyslexia needs literacy instruction that is personalized, systematic and sequential, explicit and direct, structured and process-oriented, cumulative, intensive, and multisensory. And that program must combine synthetic and analytic instruction. All right, so there's a lot we could talk about in this section, but I'm just going to highlight a few. And let's first break down this whole process of reading. So if I'm going to read a word like cat, this is just a quick overview of the steps that go into that. I have to see the letters in that word. I have to break them apart and then connect the sounds to that letter or group of letters. I have to make those sounds. I have to blend those sounds to read the word. And then I have to connect the word that I read to the meaning of that word in order to have effectively read and understood that word. A lot of steps there, right? Now, for this section of language and literacy for dyslexia, we also need to understand that reading does not stand alone. So to better understand dyslexia, we need to see how reading intertwines with these other domains. So we have listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and they're going to be acquired in that order. So think of, a little baby, right? Listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Then we also have listening and reading are going to go together as the receptive language domains, right? Information is going into my brain that people are trying to share with me. And then, of course, there is expressive with speaking and writing, where I am trying to share my thoughts with the world, either verbally or through writing. And so when we understand all of that, we see some of these other consequences for somebody with dyslexia. So, for example, having a hard time following oral instructions, sometimes saying the wrong word or mispronouncing a word at times, even if they know what they're trying to say or they know that word, they know what it means, it just kind of comes out wrong sometimes. So not only can we see this in how somebody with dyslexia is speaking, we can also see this impact when they are trying to understand what we are sharing. And you know what a lot of people do when somebody doesn't understand? Just stop and think for a second. What do you do when somebody doesn't understand what you're saying, right? If they don't understand what you're saying, what do you do? Well, you know what a really common response is? Is we just talk more, right? We add more words, we add more language, we add more description to what we're trying to communicate. And that just makes it harder, right? And what we also don't do is we don't stop and let them process. And so for some learners with language-based learning differences, that can just make it harder, right? It just makes it worse. A really common example of this is, of course, processing instructions. And so we need to stop and think that kids and students spend a lot of their day being asked to listen to adults and then do what they've been asked to do, right? Sometimes these are new things, they're novel tasks. Sometimes these are routines that they do all of the time. But we know that this can be challenging for any child, really, given their age and stage, but we know it can be even more challenging for somebody with dyslexia, especially if they have any coexisting conditions. Now, for processing instructions, here's our first tip. The biggest thing you can do is just give them wait time. So if we're looking at coexisting conditions, then that person may need up to 20 or 30 seconds to process what we're saying before they can formulate their response. Right? And to understand that, let's stop and let's talk a little bit about processing sounds and what that process looks like. So auditory processing is how our brains make sense of these sounds and speech that we hear. Now, this has nothing to do with hearing. It has to do with what the brain is doing to process and understand. So as an example, right, I may hear a noise like a car horn, and that lets me know to get out of the way. And processing speech enables us to react or respond to that person. But here's the process that it needs to go through, right? The sound is made, we hear the sound, which the hearing itself is kind of a whole other thing, but we're not talking about that. That sound or that speech then has to go into the brain where it can then be processed, and then we have to formulate a response. And of course, formulating a response is kind of its whole own can of worms as well, but we're not talking about that. But then that individual can respond either in action and or words. Right? So that's that process that's going on. And here's our second tip. If that can be hard, here's a script that we can use to give kids and teens enough time to connect with us and process our instructions before being asked to respond. So we may say something like, I want you to connect with me, right? So then they stop what they're doing and they attune to you so that they're ready to listen. Then you may say, I need you to do three things right now. Put your books away, put your shoes on, meet me at the door. Let them process it. Give me a thumbs up if you know the three things to do, right? And then you can move on. Another tip that we can do for these instructions is to have some kind of a visual cue to go with that. So we know that the more we talk, the harder it can be to process all of that language. So if we want to get something important out, some important information out, we can use nonverbal cues and communication to help that individual save their brain power to process the important bits that we are in fact trying to convey. One way we can do that is by chunking and then repeating and giving them a visual to go with it. So just as an example, get your swimsuit, get your goggles, wait by the door. Right? And then you can repeat it, have the wait time, all of that. But giving them those fingers lets them know, I've got three things I want you to do, and go do it. So that's the information that's going into our brain, right? And then they're being asked to respond. But let's quickly have one more tip about how we can support an individual with dyslexia when that information is trying to come out of their brain, right? And we can do this through cueing. Now, I don't mean cueing with reading, that's bad. But cueing with words can really help. So if they're trying to think of that word, give them the first sound or sounds or category to go with it, right? So here's an example with the spoon. I actually used this a couple weeks ago and it worked beautifully with a kiddo that was trying to get the word rice out. And I just made that sound. Bingo, they said rice, and we moved on. All right, so there's some language and literacy tips. Let's move to our second challenge area, social and emotional. As I said earlier, this is one of those heavy ones. And this is where I really realized in my practice that I need to add so much more to what I did. And that's because we cannot talk about dyslexia without acknowledging that emotional impact that a diagnosis can often have. So we know that anxiety often walks along with a specific learning disorder. We know that maybe even more so when that individual is maybe unfortunately not in a supportive learning environment, or perhaps not receiving the right kind of intensive instruction that they need. And now, of course, if we start talking about older learners, we know anxiety can be even more common. Unfortunately, data on teen anxiety has historically been kind of hard to gather because oftentimes surveys and questionnaires are actually filled out by the adult, by the parent or the caregiver. But suffice it to say, we can pretty much all agree that it's on the rise. So that's a lot, but we know all that's to say we know this is an area we really have to look at. Um, Now, I will say I am not a mental health professional, but this is one area of my work with families where I always encourage them to seek outside support whenever they feel is necessary, right? I always say, trust your instincts, and if something feels off with your child, get them help. All right. So let me start off by sharing one of my favorite nervous system resets. And actually, I was using this the other day. There's a school I work really closely with, and I was actually standing in the hallway, and it looked like I was just staring out the window. And a teacher came up, and they were like, what are you doing?" And so I explained that I was, in fact, watching the leaves flutter in the tree across the playground, and how that's one of my favorite kind of grounding nervous system reset moments. This teacher stood with me for a couple minutes and then was like, "Hey, yeah, that really worked." So that's a really good one. We'll come back to some more sensory strategies in a little bit. But another really good strategy for anxiety is that 3-3-3 rule. You can change this depending on, what works for you or your child or your teen. But typically it's going to be three things we can see, three things we can hear, and then we're going to move three body parts. So it's just a really good way to get us out of our heads and kind of back into that present moment. But we know that the better we feel about ourselves, the more confident we are. The more confident we are, the better able we are to face whatever challenges lie ahead, right? We also know that confidence and strong feelings of self-esteem or self-worth have really good benefits, right? It leads to lowered anxiety and increased ability to take risks, more resilience, and ultimately to that ability to self-advocate for one's needs, which we know is so, so important for individuals with dyslexia, that getting to that point where they can self-advocate is so empowering and will really set them up for success. Now, all that's great, right? But how do we actually foster confidence? And, I'm just going to start off by saying, I know this sounds pretty obvious, but one of the biggest things a parent can do to help their child build their own confidence is just to be your child's advocate and let them know that no matter what, you are there for them. Because, never sounds really cheesy, but never underestimate the power of a parent's unconditional love. And, just the fact that you guys are here listening to me talk already says so much. And, but here's a few more strategies. Again, I gotta say, support that intervention. I have seen this, I think, probably in every child and or family I've ever worked with. When that intervention starts working and that individual sees that it's working, that confidence goes up. Right? Now, it's not overnight. It can take time, but I've always seen it happen. Modeling confidence can be really, really important as well. I mean, kids, they learn by looking at the adults around them. So when we can, don't make it a big preachy moment, but if we can share, hey, there was that thing at work that happened and I was kind of scared about it, but I did it anyway and it felt really good. We just sort of casually share these moments. It helps kids see that we go through the same process and that it helps them hear the wording and the verbiage that we can use, and then they start to internalize that, right? Which is the whole point of modeling. Obviously, fostering responsibility. There's actually a lot of studies that have shown that even simple chores really help build that confidence because honestly, even as adults, we just want to know where we fit into the world and into our environment. And having duties or chores or responsibilities helps us see our role in that place. That growth mindset, again, really important. And a lot of this is going to come from us as the adults in that individual's life. When we're able to have that growth mindset and model it and show what it's like to live that, they'll start to pick it up too. Supporting their interests and passions is a big one. And this is one we hear a lot. The one thing I would add to this is, especially if we're talking about families with multiple kiddos, um, if you've got that one kid that's really struggling academically, let them find the passion that can be uniquely theirs. So just because Big Brother or whatever is playing basketball, maybe they want to play basketball too, and that's great, but also help them find that one thing that can be theirs and nobody else in the family can really shine in that area. That can really help them build that confidence. Of course, focus on the effort, right? It's not just about how far we're going or how great we're doing. It's about how hard we're working because we know that for kiddos with dyslexia, they're working really hard. And of course, celebrate the small wins. So if your child is in an intervention program, a lot of times they do have sort of a set scope and sequence with units or lessons or, whatever they call it, having a check mark, or having some kind of a graph can be really helpful for that individual to see that even if every session doesn't seem like I'm progressing, hey, here's all the stuff that I can now do, which is pretty cool. Another big thing that we may see for a learner with dyslexia is what we may perceive as an overreaction to things. And for this, I'll say we have to remember that by the end of the day, for that individual with dyslexia, their emotional bandwidth may be very low. They've likely spent the entire day being asked to do things that are really hard for them. And, and they may just not have a whole lot left in the tank to kind of go with the flow. But we can help kids regulate in the moment and help them build this understanding that, hey, it may seem like a mountain, but actually it's a molehill. And we can do that by rating the reaction to the problem. And so if we think about how big a reaction is it a 0 to 5 versus how big the problem is that an expected match? Is it an unexpected match? Is it a mismatch? And here's a script that can kind of walk you through that, right? Now, with these scripts, obviously, we're very neutral in our tone. We're trying to co-regulate in that moment because we know this individual is having a hard time self-regulating, so we're trying to co-regulate. But just saying something like, I see you're upset right now. It looks to me like your reaction is a 4. What problem caused you to become so upset? What size problem was it? And then they may explain. Obviously, we want to listen to them, but you then can say something like, well, I might rate that problem a 2, so it seems that maybe your reaction is unexpected. It might be a mismatch with the size of the problem. Let's try having a matched reaction. What can we do to have a matched reaction right now? All right, so there's a lot more I could say about that social emotional impact, but let's move on to that cognitive or other academic skills. So every parent, every teacher, right, wants their child or their student to be organized. But we each remember, first of all, what may be developmentally appropriate for that age and stage. We also need to remember that a child's with executive functioning challenges, that those executive functioning challenges, I should say, may also be coexisting with dyslexia, right? And if that's the case, they may find it even more difficult to be organized. So it's extra important, though, for a child with dyslexia to be organized because, as we just talked about, they're probably going to face frustrations throughout their day. And the smoother their day goes, the more brain power and the more emotional bandwidth they will have to be resilient, and to focus on whatever it is that they should be focusing on. So we can take advantage of the fact that kids and teens, and really adults as well, are super, super visual. And so we can make the final picture clear. And here's an example of how we can do that. So have your child get dressed and ready as if they're going to school. So with the right clothes on, backpack, laptop, whatever it is they have to take, all the things. Have them stand by the door with everything they need, all ready to go. Take their picture. Then print out the picture and use a marker to circle those key items that they need. And then laminate it if you need to, and then put that up where your child can easily refer to it. So the door to the garage or the door to the bus stop or, whatever it is. So just as an example, your picture may look something like this. Obviously, this is just a stock photo, but they can also then come back and circle things in categories to help them be even easier to remember. So if there's a bunch of school supplies they need, well, maybe you lay them out and you take one picture of those as a category, or you circle it in the picture as a category, because our brains, we just can't remember everything. Right? I mean, even trying to think of remembering a phone number, right? We've got to chunk it so that we can remember it. And doing the circling can help us kind of chunk out what it is we're trying to remember. All right, last section, last challenge area we're going to look at is sensory and motor integration. And now we know, I've said this a bunch, but we know that dyslexia is a word level reading challenge. So you may think that challenges with sensory and motor integration don't necessarily apply to a child with dyslexia. And yes, if we look just at the definition of dyslexia, you're right. But my experience has shown me that these are really common challenges for children with learning differences. And I want to make sure that you have the complete picture, the most complete picture I can. So this is where we're going to look. I will also say that we're seeing more evidence coming out about the comorbidity, the high likelihood of comorbidity between dyslexia and dyspraxia, which does impact that motor integration. So yeah, let's dive in. I will say I could talk about this one for forever, but I'm gonna keep it short and sweet. So let's start off by talking about sensory regulation. And so it's important to remember that sometimes emotion regulation and sensory regulation actually go hand in hand. And that's because it can be more difficult to regulate our emotions when our bodies are unregulated. But when we're talking about sensory regulation with individuals, there's kind of, especially with kids, we see this more often with kids, there are three kind of typical scenarios. So let's take a look at those. The first one is sensory seeking. This is when our body is physically seeking something. And this may mean that our brain cannot attend to whatever it is we're supposed to be paying attention to at that point. There's also sensory avoiding. And this is when we do something to lessen or to stop experiencing whatever sense is too much for us. And, so for example, I cover my ears when the ambulance goes by because it's just really bright. Some people find fluorescent lighting incredibly painful to experience. So we may try to avoid that by covering our eyes or not going in that room. The other one is sensory overload. And this is when there is just too much sensory information traveling to the brain and the brain reacts. Now, this reaction can look different for different individuals, but it could be a meltdown. It could be, quote, bouncing off the walls, or it may be just simply shutting down and going silent and still. But so those are kind of the three scenarios that we may see with sensory regulation. But we know that there are things that we can do to help give the sensory input system and the different senses what it is that that individual is seeking. And so to talk about movement, so for example, we know that sometimes students and kids may be moving in inappropriate ways. And for that situation, I should say, definitely for that situation. And what's happening is their body is likely seeking that proprioceptive input to help them regulate their systems, regulate their emotions, regulate their energy levels, all of that. So there are some specific movements that we can do that help provide that proprioceptive input. Now, quick side note on all of these is kind of black or white. It either works or it can make it worse. So you kind of just have to try these and see what works for each individual. But here's a few things that we can do to help kind of reset or provide, I should say, not reset, but provide that sensory input that that individual might be seeking. So big movements like jumping or pushing, wall push-ups, for example, also deep pressure, right? That's why weighted blankets work. That's why for some individuals, hugs during a meltdown may work. No talking, but just the physical hug. We can also find other ways to mimic that, hanging over the seat of a chair, inversion yoga poses like downward dog, lying on the belly for grounding. Then, of course, there's those rhythmic movements. So we may see chewing, swinging, spinning. Of course, then there's that spinning to activate the vestibular system. Now, with that spinning, what's actually kind of interesting is if we spin left, it's getting activated, and if we spin right, it's getting regulated. So sometimes you can see what that individual is seeking by which way they spin. I would also say for all of these, especially for that spinning one, we don't ever want to do it for too long. So kind of watch how long that movement is going on. And with the spinning, I also say that as much as possible, if we spin a certain amount one way, we kind of want to spin close to that the other way to sort of balance out that movement. There's some other things that we can do though. So to not only try to get that sensory input that we're seeking, but to help us regulate our nervous system, activate that vagus nerve. And we can do that by changing our sensory input in some way. So here's a few examples of those. So here's the one that I really like I said, looking at an object in the distance. Especially if we're spending a lot of screen time, right? To just look at something far away is kind of a reset of that sensory input. Closing our eyes can be really helpful. Lying on the ground, just lying in stillness is really helpful. We can also take sips of cold water. That temperature change can help reset that vagus nerve. Chewing on crunchy snacks can be really helpful. Of course, turning off the lights, listening to music, all of those things can help change that sensory input, which can help regulate the sensory system or activate the vagus nerve or kind of whatever it is that individual is needing at the time. So, all right, that is the end of me talking, I promise. But that was just a big picture overview on how we can support the whole child after a dyslexia diagnosis by looking beyond just reading You can find me here. So that is my website, leadchanges.com, obviously Instagram, LinkedIn, and then of course this is my book um, that's out. And I'd like to say a huge thank you. And at this point, I will stop sharing and I will take some questions. So thank you.